Hello again, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Real American History. I'm your host, Tess Evans, public historian. And today's episode is about the history of lynching in America. Now, just a warning, some of the content that I will be talking about and examples that I will be describing is very graphic in content. So, what is lynching? So, it's basically a public killing of someone by mobs of civilians and sometimes even the police. And many of these victims were black. And they had absolutely no defense or protection against these mobs. And thousands of blacks were lynched by whites before the American Civil War, when there was this fear of slave uprisings. Afterwards, during what we call Reconstruction, and then throughout the 1900s. And lynchings included hanging black people from trees, torturing them, decapitation, and some were burned alive. And pictures of lynchings were even sold as souvenir postcards. Body parts, including genitalia, were sometimes distributed to the actual audience, the people watching, or they were put on public display. And newspapers at the time would advertise a scheduled lynching so that people could come to watch if they wanted to. In 1939, a song called Strange Fruit was recorded by Billie Holiday, and this was a song protesting lynchings. And I'll read you a few of the lyrics here. Southern trees bear a strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root. Black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. So, a majority of lynchings happened in the South, and that's why these lyrics reference this specific geographical area of the U.S. And it's hard to record an official number of lynchings that happen, but organizations like the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, reports that between 1882 and 1968, 4,743 lynchings occurred, with Mississippi leading the way with 581 recorded lynchings. But again, some lynchings were never recorded within the public media, so these numbers could be a lot higher. Now, why did whites lynch blacks? Well, lynching was a way for whites to gain and or keep racial control. Many were white supremacists who didn't want blacks to vote, enter into politics, buy homes next to them, or run businesses. And whites essentially were afraid of their way of life being disrupted. And they believed that blacks also wanted to have sex with white women, and that fear of mixing races together was foremost on their minds. And this is why about a fourth of accusations against blacks were of raping white women, which were often lies. Blacks were innocent of these crimes, but whites used tactics like this to lynch. Now, white women would lie on the stand, even in court, saying that they were raped by a black man. And there are court records of those women saying later that they indeed fabricated their stories, so they lied on the stand. And some blacks who were lynched weren't even accused of a crime. They may have accidentally bumped into a white person, didn't get out of the way of whites fast enough to a white's liking, or if whites didn't like certain court rulings that ruled in favor of the black person, they'd take matters into their own hands. And here's an example of some of these court cases and how angry whites got with the rulings. So, in 1906, a black man named Edward Johnson was convicted of raping a white woman and sentenced to death by an all-white jury in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And all of these juries were all white, so they were not really a true jury of the black person's peers. And so his attorneys appealed the case and won a rare stay of execution from the U.S. Supreme Court. So he didn't die then. But in response to this, whites were so angry that they formed a mob and seized Johnson from the jail after the sheriff and his staff, for some reason, had left, dragged him through the streets, hanged him from the second span of the Walnut Street Bridge, and shot him hundreds of times. And the mob left a note pinned on his body that read, quote, "To Justice Harlan, come get your N-word now," end quote. And the last words that Johnson ever said were declaring his innocence. And actually, nearly a century later, Johnson was cleared of the rape charges. So after World War II, when Black Americans came home, they experienced this type of violence. There was a black man named George Dorsey who served several years in the Pacific, and he had been home less than a year when he, his wife, and two of their friends were shot 60 times at close range by a white mob in Georgia. And one of those friends was 7 months pregnant when she was killed. Another account was in 1947 when a black man named Joe Nathan Roberts, who was a Navy veteran, who was studying at Temple University, and he ended up visiting his parents in Georgia when he was abducted and shot to death by a group of white men who were outraged that Roberts refused to call these white men sir earlier in the day. So it wasn't just black men who were lynched either, but black women as well. And one of the more famous accounts of this happening was on May 19th, 1918, when a white mob from Brooks County, Georgia, lynched a woman named Mary Turner, who was 8 months pregnant at Folsom's Bridge. And the only crime she was committed was, publicly speaking against the lynching of her husband, which happened the day before. So on May 18th. The mob bound her feet, hanged her from a tree with her head facing down, threw gasoline on her, and burned the clothes off her body. And Mary was still alive when the mob took a large butcher's knife to her abdomen, cutting the unborn baby from her body. And when the baby fell from Mary, a member of the mob crushed the crying baby's head with his foot. The mob then riddled Mary's body with hundreds of bullets, killing her instantly. Now, there are arguments as to whether lynching has really stopped or not here in America. The last recorded lynching was in 1981, but sources like the America's Black Holocaust Museum believe, for example, that there's been lynching is continuing, and they've recorded that there's been at least 8 lynchings in Mississippi since 2000. And in 1998, James Byrd was chained to a car by 3 white supremacists and dragged to his death in the streets of Jasper, Texas. And civil rights activists today call this type of violence modern-day lynching. Thank you for joining me to learn, and as always, I will have sources and information in the description so that you can read more if you would like. And I will see you next time.